Chapter, Elliot and Rochelle for organizing this program, and to Noam and Aviva for interviewing this evening, and to Saul for participating. And thank you everyone for joining us.
Okay, thank you, Robin. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this special Yom HaShoah edition of the Storytelling Project at Shar Shemayim. I'm Rochelle Diamond. Tonight's edition is a spin-off of a unique, one-of-a-kind in Canada project that I have been privileged to work on in my professional capacity as the Director of Special Student Activities at Netivot HaTorah Day School. Names Not Numbers is an intergenerational Holocaust oral history project conceived and developed by American educator Tova Rosenberg. For the last 10 years, Netivot is the only school in Canada that has participated in this unique and creative opportunity that brings grade 8 students face to face with Holocaust survivors in our Toronto community. Our students participated in Holocaust education classes, as well as research sessions about the survivors who have agreed to be interviewed. The students are trained in journalistic skills of interviewing by local professionals, in the use of video cameras and filming techniques during interviews, and they learn post-filming editing too, all in preparation for a 90-minute interview where they asked a wide variety of questions to our survivor heroes. This entire process was filmed by a professional filmmaker who puts the various components together in a powerful and moving documentary called Names Not Numbers, a movie in the making. The films created by our school and the other participating schools are archived in the National Library of Israel, Yeshiva University, and Yad Vashem. This intense one-to-one encounter, often the first time students have directly spoken to survivors, enables our students to learn one survivor's story, and by so doing, become themselves storytellers. Last year, one of the survivor heroes whom we were privileged to interview as part of our project was Saul Nayman. Tonight, Saul has agreed to share some of his story with all of us as part of our shul's Yom HaShoah commemoration, and to be interviewed by two of our graduates who participated in last year's project, Aviva and Noam Eizicovics. Tonight's edition of the Storytelling Project truly focuses on the central importance of storytelling and how it serves as a key element of national memory and identity. Please welcome grade 9 students at the Bnei Akiva schools, Aviva and Noam, to introduce Saul Nayman.
Hi, I'm Noam. I'm a grade 9 student currently attending Yeshivat Or Chaim, and I'm looking forward to the opportunity to interview Mr. Saul Nayman. Last year, I was able to participate in Netivot HaTorah's life-changing Names Not Numbers program led by Ms. Diamond that gave students a chance to learn about a survivor, formulate meaningful questions, and to interview them. Aviva and I are honored to take part in the Shar Shemayim Storytelling Project.
My name is Aviva Eizicovics. Last year, I had the privilege of being part of the Names Not Numbers program at Netivot HaTorah under the leadership and guidance of Mrs. Diamond. It was the first time I interacted with a survivor, meeting and interviewing Mrs. Susan Pasternak. She lived under a dining room table for 3 years, was orphaned by the age of 6, and immigrated to Canada alone. I found the experience so powerful and terribly sad, yet also hopeful. When Mrs. Diamond presented me with the opportunity of interviewing Mr. Saul Nayman as part of the Shar Shemayim Storytelling Project, I immediately accepted the offer. It is my honor to hear his story so that I will be able to contribute to retelling it.
Saul Nayman is a Holocaust survivor and educator. He was born in Stoczek, Wegrowski, Poland on November 5, 1935. In September 1939, when the Nazis attacked the town, the family fled to the nearby forest. They later ended up in Bialystok, which was under Soviet control, and were deported to forced labor camps in the Soviet Union. When the war ended in 1945, they left the Soviet Union and ended up in a DP camp in Wetzlar in the American zone of West Germany.
In 1948, Saul and his family were admitted to Canada together with other Holocaust survivors as part of the Taylor Project. They came aboard the USS Samuel Davis Sturgis, docking at Pier 21 on October 16th. They settled in Montreal. Saul, his wife Queenie, and sons moved to Toronto in 1969. They have 2 sons and 5 grandchildren.
Saul is committed to Holocaust education, opposing anti-Semitism, racism, Holocaust denial, and BDS. He has spoken on numerous occasions at universities, schools, houses of worship, business groups, and the Museum of Immigration at Pier 21 in Halifax. He's returned to Poland on 5 occasions, participating in March of the Living Journeys, as well as the Living Legacy experience.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Saul Nayman to our program tonight. Thank you, Saul. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Aviva. Thank you, Noam. Thank you, Rochelle. Thank you, Rabbi Diamond. Yeshut Harav, I'm delighted to have this opportunity to speak to you. This is my 5th speaking engagement in the last 5 days. I guess in sports parlance, I would say I've been on the road for 4 events, and finally I have a home stand, and I'm delighted to be here. I want to wish all of you Chodesh Tov. It's wonderful to see a wonderful turnout of friends of ours from Shar Shemayim. About 5 years ago, I was invited to speak about the Holocaust at a Hillel-sponsored evening at the University of Toronto. I began my remarks with a quote from the great Hillel. Now, for some reason, my PowerPoint is not working. Did somebody, did that get cut off?
You have to share your screen, Saul.
I have to share my screen. I'm happy to do that. And I hope we don't have any mishaps, as unfortunately I had during the week. So let us hope that this will be a go.
Your screen's being shared, Sal. You can go through the slides now. Yes.
Okay. What there? Yeah. Sure. I have my share. You are sharing screen. There we go. As I was saying, I was speaking at a Hillel-sponsored evening at University of Toronto, and what better quote to find than one from the great rabbi, Im lo achshav eimatai, if not now when. So I must speak now because I'm one of a diminishing group of Holocaust survivors, and my future is much shorter than my past. There was a heartbreaking report from Israel where the most current records are maintained that 14,800 survivors passed away in 2019, and nearly 17,000 last year, including 900 due to the COVID-19 epidemic. The reality is that you, our students, and everyone else are the last generation that will be in the presence of Holocaust survivors and hear their testimony directly. So my mission is to inspire our youth, Jews and non-Jews alike, to promote Holocaust education, to challenge Holocaust deniers, to oppose anti-Semitism, racism, and discrimination, to seek justice and truth, to speak out, not to be silent bystanders as so many people were during the Shoah, so many millions of people in hundreds of countries, and to love, not to hate. There is so much still to be learned. We all know about Auschwitz or Treblinka or Majdanek, but how about Syktyvkar? There and other forced labor camps in the Soviet Union is where we survived, as did tens of thousands of Jews. 6 million Jews perished in the Shoah, about half in Poland, while 2.5 million died in the Soviet Union in what has often been called the parallel Holocaust. For many years, I had a conflict about being a survivor, not having been in a Nazi death camp or not having lived under Nazi occupation. This changed on a visit to the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, where I was with Queenie, who defined as Holocaust survivors all those who were displaced, persecuted, or discriminated against due to the racial, religious, ethnic, and political policies of the Nazis and their allies between 1933 and 1945. Now I must make up for lost time. My family urged me to create a memento of my survival, so I wrote my story for my 75th birthday a little over 10 years ago, dedicating it to my 5 grandchildren. It's simply called Zadie's Story, and I will share some of the elements with you. As I believe Noam indicated, I was born on November 5th, 1935, in a little shtetl called Stoczek Wegrowski, or Stok, as Jews prefer to call it. I was the second child to Yudel, Nayman, and Sarah Rose Rosenberg. This is the only photo that we have with me and my sister. I think I was about 3.5 years old there. My sister Manya was 7 years older. I was named in memory of my maternal grandfather, David Shlomo Rosenberg. He was a sofer, a scribe of holy works like Torah scrolls, tefillin, mezuzah parchments, always using, of course, the required tools, a special quill and ink, and of course, kosher parchment. He did his work as a holy calling, never accepting money. My father described him as the gentlest man he had ever known, a true tzaddik, a righteous person who imbued my mother with love and kindness, which she embodied all her life and perhaps passed on that love to me. My mother was born in 1904, my father in 1905. They were married in 1927. My mother was a beautiful woman, and we treasure the few photos that we have of her when she was young. Sadly, she suffered from serious stomach problems, which required complex surgery. She had to be on a special lifelong diet and medications, yet she somehow survived incredible setbacks throughout her short life of only 52 years. The only grandparent I had at that time was my maternal grandmother, Esther Dova. She had a small food counter in front of our house from which she sold eggs, cheese, milk, and other staples. Mondays, market days, were busiest when Poles from surrounding villages came to trade, barter, sell, or buy products. She traveled every week to Warsaw, about 45 kilometers away, to shop there, and always brought back a special treat for Shloimele and for Manya, a cake, an orange, a banana, and was always very, very kind to us. Our town had a population of about 1,000 Jews and a like number of Polish people. The days were peaceful with everyone going about their business. Life was simple but difficult. Our house, like most others, was a wooden shack in which we ate, slept, and worked. We had little, but we did not need much. My only possession was a white hand-me-down rocking horse, which I used to sit and rock in front of the house. And when it was hot in the summer, I would take my Bubba's quart, the measuring quart for milk, fill it with water, and give it to my horse to make sure that the horse could continue on a hot day as I would rock it. My father had no trade or work skills, but was extremely well-read, devouring every Yiddish paper or book that he could find. He was not religious. He had gone through Cheder and yeshiva, but then the social movement that grasped so many young people embraced my father, and my father embraced it, and he became a lifelong ardent member of the Bund. On Friday afternoons, my sister and I would carry our pot of chun to the baker to simmer overnight, And on Shabbat, we would pick it up and enjoy a warm meal. He also baked our matzahs, and that, of course, was before Manischewitz or Aviva. And just before Pesach, my sister and I would go and pick up our matzahs, wrap them in a beautiful white tablecloth, bring them home, and it would be stored in a special drawer until the Seder time. And before Pesach, there would be a community burning of the chametz in the nearby woods. It was really quite a wonderful scene. Life went on simply day to day until September 1st, 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland. Stock was virtually destroyed on September 9th, and our family and others fled to the nearby forest. My father carried me wrapped in a maroon duvet, and from a distance, we could see the town on fire and the Wehrmacht as they rolled in on motorcycles, trucks, cars, and horseback. This was the image that I saw when we were hiding in the woods. And when I was trying to add some context to my story, I found this photograph, and it was taken by a Wehrmacht soldier. And it's something that is absolutely incredible that I could see this in a photo that I had in my mind for so many years. My grandmother heard that our little hospital was on fire and decided to go back to help if possible. Unfortunately, that was the last time we saw her. We hid in the woods for some time, but had to move on as we were all in peril. We headed northeast and somehow made it to Białystok, about 100 kilometers from our town. I don't know how we got there, but we got there. Białystok at that time became part of the Eastern Poland area, which came under control of the Soviets based on the Hitler-Stalin Treaty. On September 17th, Poland ceased to exist as a country. The eastern part of Poland was controlled by the Soviets, and the rest of Poland was controlled by the Nazis. Białystok became a refuge for many Jews and my family, as it was felt that it was quite safe to be under the Soviet occupation or Soviet control, rather, of course, than the Nazi control. The Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, one of the worst mass killers in history, inadvertently saved thousands of Jewish families, including ours. He ordered the deportation of some 300,000 Jews from Soviet-occupied Eastern Poland to forced labor camps deep in the Soviet Union and Siberia. Before the war, there were about 35,000 Jews in Białystok. After the occupation, the area had about 300,000 Jews. So we were among the deportees packed into old filthy cattle cars and began a journey to an unknown destination. There was no food or water on board. A hole in the floor served as the toilet. The air was foul and unbearable. Many days and about 2,600 kilometers later, we arrived in Syktyvkar, at that time the capital of the Komi Republic. It was late 1939, the onset of our first unbearably cold winter. Syktyvkar is just west of the Ural Mountains in Siberia and just south of the Arctic Circle. The need was to rebuild factories and housing barracks. My father had no building skills, but became a glazier. These photos illustrate, to some extent, the kind of camp in which we were ensconced, and a rendering of some of the natives. They very much resembled the indigenous population of Canada. We were crammed into a small room in one of the barracks with another couple named Mida. A hanging sheet separated us. Wooden planks served as beds, and we shared a premise stove for cooking. We had to burn peat or dried cow dung in a metal barrel for heat. The barracks had no sanitation, no toilets. There was no running water or electricity. For light, we had to use kerosene lamps. The rooms were separated by a long corridor, which was occupied by squatters, those who did not have a family or did not have a room in which to live. My father struck up a conversation with one of the squatters, and he turned out to be his nephew Moshe, son of my father's brother Leib. So Moshe entered our life, and we're grateful that he did. Life was brutal, especially in winter, which seemed to last 8 months. There was nothing there. There was no food, there was no heat, there was no warmth. All there was starvation, horribly cold weather, and diseases. There was no medication. For example, Mrs. Mida sustained a splinter in her finger, which became infected. Mrs. Mida died from a splinter because there was no medication with which to treat her. It was horrible. My mother somehow survived beyond belief based on what she had to go through. And unfortunately, the dead would be stripped of their clothing or shoes and anything that could be salvaged. The only thing that we had of value was the maroon duvet and several Fragé silverware pieces from my parents' wedding. Fragé was one of the most famous makes in Europe. Moshe was the go-getter, as I said, so he traded some of the pieces on the black market for 22-karat gold from the Tsarist era. This is much larger, of course, than the coin was. These were rare and valuable, and anyone found with one would be in danger. So the coin was sewn into the garment that I was wearing for safekeeping, and obviously to keep it away from soldiers, because soldiers wouldn't bother a child, especially a wee little one like me. On June 22nd, 1941, Hitler broke his treaty with Stalin and launched Operation Barbarossa. The Soviet Union was invaded, and Hitler's Einsatzgruppen unleashed their slaughter. Before Hitler invaded the Ukraine, Stalin declared a scorched earth policy in the nation's breadbasket. Everything had to be destroyed. All the infrastructure had to be destroyed so that the Germans who were advancing on Ukraine would not benefit from anything that could help them. While millions of Ukrainians and others starved in that scorched earth, it was really one of the turning points in the war. Many Ukrainians initially welcomed the Germans as their liberators from the yoke of Soviet domination. Many became guards in Nazi camps and participated with the SS Einsatzgruppen in horrible atrocities, especially at Babi-Yar, one of the most notorious, when 34,000 Jewish men, women, and children were stripped and shot in front of open pits. This was just a horrendous atrocity. And there were about 1.5 million Jews in the Ukraine, of whom 600,000 perished. Later, the Ukrainian government, after the war, established these memorials in memory of those who perished and the children. There was a great need to start rebuilding the shattered republic. So we were shipped from Syktyvkar to a village near Haivoron in the Ukraine, another trip of about 2,300 kilometers, in conditions similar to the one in 1939. The task was to rebuild a destroyed sugar factory. We had a small room in the factory barracks, but it was certainly much, much better than what we had in Syktyvkar. A nearby family, the Mogilas, like most Ukrainians who were pathologic anti-Semites, were very kind to us, especially to my mother, often sharing their farm products. It's been said that no one survived the Holocaust without the help of somebody. And I have to say, the Mogilas were incredibly kind, and were it not for their help and generosity, I don't think my mother would have survived the Ukraine. The radio reports became more positive. The Soviet armies, led by Marshal Zhukov, advanced through Poland. In that little village, I went to school, as did my sister. And that blue arrow points to this little white rabbit fur cap, which I was able to identify as mine. The school was basically one room with perhaps 3 or 4 or 5 classes. Nobody knew. We survived that, and the war ended on May 7th, 1945, and our next stage of life was to begin. So what's next? We were able to leave the Soviet Union because the government declared that anyone who did not want to become a citizen could leave. So we left under the auspices of the United Nations Refugee Relief Association. And after a trip of nearly 3,000 kilometers from Czechoslovakia and Austria, we arrived in the Soviet zone of Lower Silesia, a little town called in Polish Boża Góra, in German Gottesberg, or God's Mountain. It was ironic that we were in a little shtetl, a little town called God's Mountain, because after nearly 5 years in the Soviet Union, there was not one word of religion, there was not one word of Torah, there was not one Shabbat, there was not one Yom Tov, there was nothing. The Soviets absolutely abhorred any religion except their religion, which was communism, and they worshipped only one God, and that was Stalin. So that was rather ironic. In summer 46, we were sent on our next destination, a tent city in the United States zone of West Germany. Here we were reunited with my mother's Aunt Rivka and her uncle Noam. Again, it was a dreadful time there. It was hot and the tents were like ovens. Everyone in our family was sick except me, but we got through that. And the next stop was Wetzlar, near Frankfurt in the US zone of West Germany. Wetzlar was home of a massive SS camp where we were housed among 4,200 displaced persons. We were reunited with another nephew of my father's, other relatives and townsfolk. And for the first time, we began hearing of the horrendous atrocities committed by the Nazis. We had absolutely no knowledge of the Shoah in the Soviet Union. We met survivors. We heard their stories. We saw their emaciated bodies. We saw the numbers tattooed on their arms. Even my mother looked very emaciated after suffering through the Soviet Union. But we felt very fortunate in comparison with them. And that's one reason why I didn't feel that I was a survivor. But we were starting a new life. There were weddings, children were born, schools were established. I went to Beit Sefer Tarbut, started learning Hebrew, and soon I was reasonably fluent. We acquired a Leica camera, which was the most famous product of Wetzlar, where Ernst Leitz invented the 35mm camera. It became the main instrument that the Nazis used to compile their massive photo archives. A sense of community prevailed. Zionism became rooted among many families. So we started, of course, worrying about our future. Those who wanted to go to Palestine knew it would be difficult under the British mandate. The choices were a DP camp in Germany or a detention camp in Cyprus. Even after the declaration of Israel's independence on May 14, 1948, which I listened to in class, and that was our class, our teacher told us that afternoon we'd be listening to a special broadcast. And by the way, I joined Beitar. I thought that their motto, Rak Kach, was what suited me, but I didn't know Rak Kach from any other reason, except I was given a nice little black uniform, a nice little cap, and a pair of white shorts, and that was good enough reason to join the Beitar. But I really admired Zev Jabotinsky and his philosophy. So that was May 14th, 1948, when we listened to David Ben-Gurion proclaim the state of Israel. Unfortunately, the next day, Israel was attacked on all sides by its Arab neighbors. So Israel was out of the question for us. So where were we going to go? There was a famous Yiddish song, Wohin soll ich gehen? Tell me, where can I go? We tried to get a visa to the US, that didn't work. Other countries wouldn't accept us. We heard that Canada was accepting a limited quota of tailors to work in Winnipeg in the growing garment industry there. Several prominent Canadian Jewish manufacturers led by Max Enkin and Sam Poslims and others petitioned the government to allow tailors to come, and undoubtedly provided financial guarantees, or I think we call it blood money. It was finally agreed to admit 2,500 immigrants, but only half were to be Jews. We know very well what Canada's policy was before the war. It was none is too many. So my father had to apply as a tailor, but did not know one end of a needle from another. But a cousin, who was a master tailor, took the test, posing as my father. We were also told that Manya and Moshe and I would be able to go, but not my parents because of my mother's ill health. But that didn't stop us. That didn't stop Moshe. It was suggested that if Moshe and Manya were married, it might improve our chances. So they got a fake marriage certificate and were married, but in Montreal in 1950, after we arrived there, they were officially married. So we had now a marriage certificate, a tailor certificate. So Moshe again went to have a chat with the immigration official. This time, Moshe, who was very smart, very sharp, very shrewd, brought with him a little gift, that little 5-ruble gold coin. And lo and behold, we got a visa to Canada. So the gold coin led us to this golden land. Later, I learned of the remarkable courage of Ernst Leitz. After Kristallnacht in November 1938, he realized that his German Jewish employees would be in peril. He secretly established the Leica Freedom Train, enabling Jews to leave Germany as Leitz employees. This later was commemorated in a film and a book. And Ernst Leitz, like Oskar Schindler and thousands of others, risked their lives to save Jews and are honored as righteous among the nations at Yad Vashem. The trip was scheduled for fall 1948, right after Rosh Hashanah, which we thought of as a new life, not just a new year. We were gathered at the train station, and after a trip to Bremerhaven, this time in real train cars, we boarded the USS Samuel Davis Sturgis, a transport ship of the US Navy. We departed on October 8th for Halifax, a journey of 9 days. Yom Kippur occurred en route. A shul was set up for those who wanted to daven. And on Shabbat, October 16th, we landed at Pier 21 in Halifax. I saw George's Island with this famous lighthouse in the port. For me, it was like the Statue of Liberty, which I had seen in pictures. Incidentally, on that very same ship, on that very same day, Henry Zagdansky, Zichrono Livracha, and Louis Tannenbaum were also passengers. I was invited to speak at Pier 21 during Holocaust Education Week 2 years ago, and it was a wonderful experience for me. And when I went through the Immigration Museum, I saw this sign, which I had seen in 1948, and I made a comment about it. In 1948, this sign was very prominent. It welcomed people coming to Canada in 7 different languages, but you don't see Bruchim Habayim. There was nothing in Hebrew or Yiddish. But I was told that at the airport, there actually is a sign, Bruchim Habayim. I just want to take a little moment of levity. When I went through the Immigration Museum, which has been restored and contains many of the original artifacts, there was this sign still very prominent. And I must say that was perhaps my first love affair in Canada. I saw this beautiful sign with this very attractive young lady. And I didn't know what it meant, but then I realized that she was selling something that looked very good. And it said, drink Coca-Cola. I thought that the swirl on the L was a T. So I thought, wow, Coca-Cola must be good if she is suggesting that people have it. There was one problem. Coca-Cola costs 5 cents. I didn't even have 2 cents. So how could I drink Coca-Cola? I found a bottle with a little bit of Coca-Cola in it. I drank it, and that was my first taste of Canada, and it was wonderful. In that Museum of Immigration, I was shown a sign on one of the columns. I've been blessed well beyond my wildest dreams. I survived the Holocaust with my immediate family and built a new life in an extraordinary country, Canada. Whatever success I have achieved has been inspired and supported by family, friends, and business associates. I didn't know it was there until my granddaughter had received an email from a friend of hers who asked if she was related to Saul Nayman. I said, yeah, my Zadie. So I saw it when I was there. I was given a very lovely memento, a photograph of the ship, the Sturgis, and on it was an inscription. Canada became a better place on October 16, 1948, when the Nayman family arrived at Pier 21 in Halifax. I gave a lot of thought to that statement and thought, perhaps there is some truth to it. Perhaps we and the 40,000 other survivors who made Canada their home, in fact, made it a better place. I then thought of another ship that also sailed from Germany, but it was 9 years earlier in 1939, the SS St. Louis with 947 passengers aboard, most of them Jews. The ship, of course, was refused entry and had to return to Germany, and later about 250 of those passengers were murdered. What would these Jews have done to make Canada a better place in the fields of medicine, science, technology, the arts? How many future Nobel laureates may have been on that ship? There's, of course, no answer, but I could suggest an indirect one. Just think of what the Holocaust survivors and their descendants have contributed to Israel and to the world. I'd like to break before I go to my next segment. And if Aviva and Noam or anyone have any comments, questions, I'd be very happy to answer them. But first, I'll take a sip of water.
Thank you so much. I'm going to invite Noam and Aviva, if that's okay with you, to begin some of their questions on your presentation and your experiences. So is that okay, Saul?
Absolutely.
Amazing.
That's what I'm getting paid for.
Okay, Aviva, Noam, Bakasha.
Thank you. So, Mr. Nayman, you speak to Jewish groups and non-Jewish groups. Can you compare the response you received from both?
That's a very excellent question, Noam. And by the way, I know you're incredibly polite and well-mannered. Mr. Nayman, I keep saying, is my son. I'm Saul. Obviously, Jewish students, Jewish teens like you, your sister, have a tremendous advantage of having had an opportunity to learn about the Shoah, be it at your parents' dinner table, at school, at shul, etc. Non-Jewish children don't have the same advantage, but they do have a significant interest in the Holocaust. And when I speak to mixed, and I shouldn't say the word, use the word mixed groups, when I speak to Jews and non-Jews, I try to ensure that the message is all-encompassing. The Shoah was the genocide of all genocides, but I always ensure that genocides are discussed, are part of my presentations. I remind everyone that the United Nations has recorded 50 genocides, of which came 15 years after the Shoah. So there's been no shortage of hatred, whether it was in Armenia or Uganda, Biafra, Cambodia, etc., etc., etc. There's no shortage of hatred going on right now in Myanmar, in China, where thousands and thousands of Muslims are being sent to reorientation centers. To me, they're simply like the ghettos. So the non-Jewish population has a great need to understand what can happen when we stay silent, when we don't oppose the hates and the horrible things that are happening around the world. But the advantage certainly is among our Jewish young people. And not only is it an advantage, it's a greater responsibility, because you, Aviva, and you, Noam, and your peers must carry on the message. When you listen to a witness, you become a witness, and you must pass it on. And as I said earlier, you are the last generation that is going to be in the presence of survivors. Your children, may you be blessed with many, Ken Yobu, are not going to be able to be in the presence of Holocaust survivors. Wonderful question, Noam. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saul. And kind of building on that, the word Holocaust is sometimes used to describe sad or tragic events in modern history. How do you feel about the way this word is used?
Well, originally, it was not used with respect to the Shoah. The Shoah was the Israeli, the Hebrew word for Holocaust. The Holocaust was initially defined as genocide, and genocide was a word that was essentially put into use by a wonderful Jewish writer. Unfortunately, I don't remember the name. And then the word Holocaust, which is from the Greek holocaustos, a great upheaval, is what became the identifying term for the Shoah, for the genocide of all genocides. Is it overused? It's abused. If you see what's going on, and I'm sure you have on Google and Facebook and Twitter, what has gone on with denigrating the Holocaust, it's just deplorable. At least there is some movement now to curtail some of that horrendous stuff that's been going on. But if you would just Google Holocaust, you'd be astonished at the kind of nonsense and garbage that is spewed out. And we see it in the marches of the white supremacists. I marveled when I saw one of the marchers in one of the white supremacist events. He had to be a Holocaust denier, because all of them are Holocaust deniers. And yet this man was wearing a t-shirt, and on it was Auschwitz, 6MWNE. 6 million was not enough. That is a little bit of a ridiculous thing, that a Holocaust denier would even intimate that 6 million did perish, and that 6 million was not enough. And that man wearing that t-shirt, he looked like a huge mountain of a man, holding the hand of a little boy, maybe 5 years old, and the little boy had a beautiful little t-shirt with a huge red swastika on it. So we see that. We see that on TV, we see that in the news, we see that on every medium that you can find, and it's horrible.
So are you ever concerned that people will get tired of hearing about the Holocaust or stop paying attention?
Yes. In fact, a few years ago, I wrote about a very well-known Jewish educator who suggested that enough is enough. You know, people are getting tired of listening, hearing about the Holocaust. You know, give us a break. We've heard enough. We are being, according to him, portrayed as victims. Well, I don't agree with that at all. Our victimhood has ended. Yes, we'll still be attacked. Yes, we'll still be targets of horrendous anti-Semitism and horrendous abuse, and very often death, as we know what happened in Pittsburgh and in Poway and in New York and in Paris. But our victimhood ended, and we will no longer be victims. We will not be victims to the Hezbollah. We will not be victims to those who marched in Charlottesville screaming, Jews will not replace us, etc., etc. We remember the past, but we look to the future, and that's the essence of Judaism. So regardless of what some people feel, some people think, our story has not ended by any means, and we must continue telling about the Holocaust. And I have a wonderful quote, which I will share with you a little bit later with respect to that. So shall I continue to my second part, and then we'll have some more discussions?
Sure.
Wonderful, thank you.
Saul, before you continue, I'm just a little mindful of the time. It's 9:19 and we're supposed to be wrapping up in about 11 minutes or so. So I don't know exactly how long this next part is, but I do want to give time for questions, and I see a couple of questions are coming in on the chat. So would you be prepared to entertain a couple more questions? Would that be okay? Or
now or later, whatever you want. Please bear in mind that we didn't start right on time.
I am, sir. No, you're absolutely, you're correct. So why don't we take another question from either Noam and Aviva? And I see
Sure.
a couple have also been put into the chat. So Aviva, is it your turn?
Thank you so much for that. Our last question here is, when you speak to students as opposed to adults, do you change your presentation or message? If so, why and how?
The answer basically is no, because the message is the message. What I perhaps avoid is some of the horrible, really horrible aspects of the Shoah. Some of the atrocities, for example, in Wetzlar, I held a bar of soap made of Jewish fat, marked with the Nazi logo, RJF, reines Judenfett. A lampshade made of Jewish skin. I avoid that when I speak to young students because it's perhaps a little too much. And on occasion, I've had other survivors say to me, you know, Saul, cool it a little bit. But most of the presentation, most of the things I say are essentially the same. But I do have to mind when I'm talking, say, to a grade 5 as opposed to a grade 12, I have to temper it a little bit.
Thank you, Saul. Why don't you continue now for a few more moments, please?
Thank you. Well, I'll change my hats now because I'll be talking about one of my very favorite things in life. After our liberation, I studied many aspects of the Shoah. visited museums, read books, watched films, heard stories, met with survivors. Yes, I knew much, but nothing prepared me for the emotional impact of being in Auschwitz for the first time and standing under the gate with that obscene Arbeit macht frei inscription. It was very, very hard for me to take that. And particularly ending up in Birkenau, there's no proper photograph of Birkenau from the air to show the size of that horrendous place. 470 acres created for one purpose only, and that's for death. And 1.1 million of our people perished in that horrendous place. But there's something important that came out of there. And as we did last Thursday on Yom HaShoah, I'll go back to what would have been had we not had COVID-19 hit us. On Yom HaShoah, oh, by the way, here's the quote that I wanted to share with you. There's only one thing worse than Auschwitz itself, and that is if the world forgets there was such a place. And that was said by Henry Appel, a survivor of Auschwitz. So last Thursday, we would have been on the March of the Living, on Yom HaShoah. And we would have gathered with the survivors from Canada, from Toronto particularly, in front of the Canadian contingent. And I particularly selected this slide. The man in the middle in the white hair with the sunglasses happens to be Judge Thomas Walter. He was the judge who presided at the trial of Oskar Groening, the accountant of Auschwitz. And Judge Thomas Walter was able to get a guilty sentence. Groening died of old age, but he was judged guilty. And Judge Walter said he did that to give back some dignity, which they lost forever in the gas chambers of Auschwitz. And then we would move on the march, that 3.3 kilometer walk from Auschwitz to Birkenau. Reuben Rivlin, the president of Israel, said, we should start calling it the March from Auschwitz to Yerushalayim, and I think he's quite right. We'd end up in Birkenau, and this is what the march looks like. Over 10,000 people from over 40 countries, just a wave of blue walking from Auschwitz to Birkenau, where we gather, and so many of our students bring with them little plaques on which they inscribe generally someone in memoriam, or never again, or long live Israel, or whatever. I carry one too. It simply says, learn to love. Then we assemble at the south end of Birkenau for the closing Yom HaShoah ceremony. And we stand with about 50 survivors from all over the world. And we stand tall and proud. And we make up the biggest choir in the world as we sing Hatikva at the biggest Jewish cemetery in the world. And I think Hitler and his cohorts must be squirming in whichever hell they're rotting. And a beautiful thing following that Hatikva is that a week later, we march from the Kotel, we march from the center of Yerushalayim to the Kotel, and we stand and sing Hatikva proudly at the biggest, holiest Jewish site in the world. I'd like to go quickly to where we would have been today had the march still continued, if it were not for the pandemic. We would have got up early for a journey to the Lupachova forest and the Tickocin synagogue The Tickocin synagogue is a beautiful, beautiful place. The Lupachova forest is the most beautiful, ugly place in the world. The beauty of that site is indescribable, as these trees would suggest. But we all march through that forest in utter silence because everyone knows what we're going to see. We are going to see mass graves, open pits at which 1,400 Jews from Tickocin were gathered and sent to be slaughtered. And then we're each assigned a speaking platform in whichever place the survivors prefer. Mine is Treblinka. And I open my comments with welcome to my neighborhood death camp. Treblinka was 25 kilometers from Eizicovics. And on 2016, my first march, I was there with my grandson Maurice, who's standing between Rabbi Dolgan and myself. We found our stone there, Stoczek, in the Sokolov County. 2019, I had the privilege of being there with Queenie, and frankly, Queenie's the real survivor in the family for having put up with me for about 60 years. There's no question who the real survivor is. I speak at that place and I tell them of what went on in Treblinka, how the Nazis in the space of 18 months murdered 870,000 of our people, men, women, and children. Treblinka was totally destroyed by the Nazis before the Soviets liberated it. And Treblinka is full of various stones, various stone monuments. There are 17,000 of them, as a matter of fact. I'll just skip that for one moment and I'll come back to it. That's what you see in Treblinka. There are about 17,000 stones, which represent what a day's killing would be. And I suggest to my students that when they look at their stones, the stones with their eyes, they see stone shapes with different jagged edges, etc., etc. But if they close their eyes and just imagine that a stone might represent a child, it might represent a teenager like them, or it might represent an adult, a Zaidi like me, because that's what those stones really are supposed to be. And I suggest to them, when you listen to a survivor, listen with your heart. Remember what the survivor has said to you and keep that in your heart and in your soul forever, because it must never be forgotten. I had an extra trip in 2019 with the Aish Living Legacy Group. And at that stone of Stoczek, there are several hundred of them representing stones from the towns in which Jews were shipped to their death. And I always locate that stone, stone number A91, so that I can recite Kel Mala Rachamim for my grandmother and for other members of our town who have perished, and say Kaddish. And when I spoke that day in June, it was a horrible, miserable day, raining all day long. But when I finished speaking, lo and behold, there was a magnificent rainbow over Treblinka. And I don't know, maybe it was a sign that Hashem sent to me. I'll take it as such. And that was the rainbow, that was me, that was the stone. And before I leave Treblinka, I always recite a silent prayer. Baruch atah Hashem shelo asani efer b'Treblinka. I thank Hashem for not turning me into ashes at Treblinka, because that's what I would have been. I would have been in one of the ash pits had we not fled when we did. There's only one thing about Stoczek that still has a tiny reminder about there having been a Jewish community. There was nothing at all. The only person who survived in Stoczek during the war was a woman named Chasha Bardi. She was hidden by a Polish family who was inscribed at Yad Vashem as a righteous among the nations. Chasha emigrated to Palestine, and when Israel became a nation, she returned to Poland, and with a very prominent activist, was able to persuade Stoczek to allow her to create a little cemetery and one tombstone. De Kedoshim von Stock. Du ruhen de Kedoshim von Stock. Here rest the Kedoshim from Stock. And that is a wonderful, wonderful act of generosity and kindness that Chasha was able to commit. And I will close my remarks with this. I thank you for your kind attention. If I have run a little bit over time, you don't have to include it in my appearance fees. And I'll turn that over now to Aviva and Noam, or whatever you wish. I'm all yours.
Thank you so much, Saul. There was one question that came in through the chat that I wanted to know if you would be willing to answer is, do you think that, are you becoming more or less optimistic about Canadian and the world's dealing with racism?
No. It's a horrible thing to say, no, because there's just so much hatred and so much racism spewed through the media. And it does not take much to spread it. I'm not optimistic. I'm optimistic about everything except that. So we just have to be very wary. We have to educate as best as we can and confront it as best as we can, even at the peril of pain, sometimes worse than pain. But if we let it go unchallenged, it will just metastasize into something even more horrendous. And we're seeing what's happening in Africa, in Cambodia, in China, as I said. It's horrible. It is horrible. Those, if I were to share with you the 8 stages of the Holocaust, you're seeing some of those stages being enacted now. The Holocaust wasn't just 1939 to 1945. It began in 1925 by one man, Adolf Hitler, with his book Mein Kampf, then his getting the power in 1933, then the Nuremberg laws, then Kristallnacht. It didn't just happen on September 1st, 1939. It was fomenting and fermenting for years. And we see a lot of that happening now. We see what happened in the United States on January 6th. How could that happen in the nation's capital of the greatest democracy in the world? One man can do it. So unfortunately, I'm not optimistic. But I'm optimistic that we as a people will do our utmost to strive for a better day, to strive for a brighter day, to strive for a little more love. That's really sort of my nom de plume, learn to love.
Let me conclude then with your optimistic view of the future. You know, thank you, first of all, Saul, for opening up your heart and opening up your past and allowing us to feel a little bit about the things that you felt and to see a little bit of the things that you have seen. But one of the things that I think I feel optimistic about as a people is just how good we are at telling stories. And every year we sit around tables all over the world, families and multi-generations, and we tell a story. We tell a story of sadness, and we tell a story of enslavement, and we tell a story of liberation. We know how to tell stories. But you said something in the beginning that has deeply resonated with me, how, in fact, for a while, you didn't see yourself as a survivor. And you needed to sort of change your perception of yourself. And so for so many years that many of us have been privileged to hear the words and the recollections and the feelings of people like you, survivors, we're the listeners. But you remind us that we will be called upon to change our perception, and we'll be called upon to move from being listeners to being ourselves the storytellers. And as you said, and you said it so powerfully, that if you witness a witness, you hear the story of a survivor, then you too become a witness. So this has been a mass transformation tonight. Everybody who's part of the Zoom call has been transformed from a listener to a storyteller. And I think you get the credit, and hopefully our tradition, our religion, the ability to tell a story that's so deeply ingrained in us will be the vehicle that moves your story forward in the story of all other survivors. Let me end with a bracha to you, Saul, to Queenie, and to all these survivors. May Hashem bless you with long life and good health. May you continue to share your story. May you continue to inspire, as you did to many of us tonight. And I'm seeing the comments coming in on the chat, just how inspiring and meaningful tonight was. So on behalf of all of the listeners, thank you so much. For those of you who want to learn a little bit more about Names Not Numbers, or to actually watch the video, the movie that Noam and Aviva were part of, I included the link to the YouTube video at the beginning part of tonight's chat. So that's certainly something that all of you can access. I want to thank Noam and Aviva for your thoughtful questions and your willingness to jump right in and to undertake to be such an important part of Sher Shemaim's storytelling project. I also want to invite all the listeners to come back on April 19th at 8:30, as Dalia Younger will interview Farouk Hakimi, who will share his experiences of growing up Jewish in Iran. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for being part of this extraordinary initiative. Thank you again, Saul. And ladies and gentlemen, have a good night. May we all be blessed with long life and good health. And as Saul said, perhaps the next time we'll sing Datikva together at the largest holy site in the world, at the Kotel. Thank you. And
Thank
good
you.
night.
Good night. Good night, everyone. Amen.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank
And
you so